Hey guys, it's Rachel and it is Thursday again already, and this week we're continuing with the rotation that we started last week, which is looking at eating disorders and comorbidity. With regards to comorbidity, I think that I want to be careful here because I think that a person can be dealing with a number of issues that can be connected to another disorder, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a diagnosable disorder, or whether a person has not been diagnosed with it for numerous reasons, or whether it is necessarily something that a person feels to struggle with comorbidity, that they have to have had the diagnosis of an eating disorder and then the other disorder. I know last week we discussed depression, but just because a person is struggling with an eating disorder which has been diagnosed and they haven't been diagnosed with another disorder doesn't mean that they're not struggling with something with regards to comorbidity. So if there's anything you take from these videos, I don't want you to feel that you have to have had another diagnosis, either axis 1, which is anxiety disorder, mood disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, or an axis 2 disorder, which are personality disorders, obsessive personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, etc. And this week we're going to actually be looking at eating disorders and psychosis and schizophrenia. What I want to say now is that just because a person deals with periods of psychosis does not mean they're necessarily schizophrenic. There are people who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia who do have eating disorders, or at least have been diagnosed with schizo-affective disorder. And that is something that is quite common within eating disorders. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there, that just because you don't have a diagnosis doesn't mean that you're battling with a number of different things. And I say the same for you with regards to your eating disorder, that just because it's not been diagnosed doesn't mean that you're not struggling with it, doesn't mean that you're not ill, doesn't mean that you genuinely don't have an eating disorder. So whether it's diagnosed or not, and whether the other issues you've had are diagnosed or not, does not mean that you are struggling. Of course, if it can be recognised that you are dealing with some form of other disorder, that it can be helpful with regards to your treatment. The rule I go by, and I do believe I said something to do with this last week, is that an eating disorder is a hell of a lot more complicated and complex than a lot of people allow us to believe. Eating disorders are a mental health issue, which might sound like the most obvious thing in the world, but people don't. There isn't the same stigma around eating disorders as there is around other mental health problems. When you're talking mental health problems concerning psychosis, hallucinations, schizophrenia, that is when people freak out. That is when you freak out personally if you're having experienced them. You may feel incredibly, I wouldn't use the word ashamed, but frightened of sharing that with somebody else, because you're scared that somebody's going to say, oh, you're a schizophrenic. I know people who do deal with psychotic, not necessarily psychotic episodes, that's something that's quite specific, but certainly issues revolving around psychosis, such as hallucinations, such as periods of disreality, detachment, dissociation, different multiple selves, which is something that all of us day to day deal with, because we're maybe a different person with our best friend or a family than we are in the work environment. And schizophrenia doesn't have to necessarily present itself in the way that we're led to believe, that this person has these crazy million voices in their heads. And I do know people through other people who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and with the right medication actually live a normal life and work and interact. It of course is something that will need monitoring, but there are people who have been through treatment for schizophrenia, and once the medication has been managed, that can continue to just live a normal life, and that isn't maybe something that as a public that we expect to happen. There are so many names that go around, you know, you're schizo, you're schizophrenic, you're a freak, you know, all of those things, and it's actually used as quite a derogatory term, which doesn't occur in the same way in eating disorders or other mental health problems. So what I want to do is just kind of discuss maybe what issues with psychosis are, and try and just give you an idea of potentially why this is happening and why you may be dealing with periods where you could be experiencing symptoms of psychosis. Okay, trauma is incredibly common within eating disorders. A number of people who struggle with eating disorders have experienced extreme trauma in their life. That doesn't necessarily have to have been as traumatic as other people may have experienced, but it might have been experienced as more traumatic. I don't know whether I'm quite making sense there, but basically that people have different levels of trauma, they have different types of trauma, and how a person reacts to that trauma is individual to that person. So one person may have experienced trauma their whole life, whether it be sexual abuse or what have you, and deal with it in a very different way than somebody who has maybe been raped once as a teenager. And so it all depends on the person, and that's the same in an illness like schizophrenia. You know, it manifests itself in a number of different ways, and it's not always known exactly what can cause schizophrenia. Now, one of the things that is linked to schizophrenia is drug abuse. I have personally been in contact with people who clearly struggled because they had addiction issues with drugs, and who have literally flipped into psychosis and slipped into psychosis in a way where they are completely detached from reality, whereby they are not able to be on their own, because they literally live in their own world. So they may have unusual thoughts and beliefs about what's going on. They may feel like a person is talking to them and telling them how to act in a certain way, and I believe it's a very, very difficult illness to diagnose because of how it manifests itself so differently. Bring into that an eating disorder, and I think you have even more of a problem, okay? Because let's face it, eating disorder symptoms, when you're not eating right, when your body is under such stress, when your mind is not able to function normally because of lack of food, I believe that if you are to diagnose somebody with some form of access to diagnosis, that you need to have some of the eating disorder symptoms under control. And I know a number of people who have been diagnosed, for example, with borderline personality disorder, which is, I'm not going to discuss here and will be covered later, but that have been diagnosed with those issues, and very much it is associated to their eating disorder. So I had periods of psychosis, I had hallucinations, I had periods of dissociation, detachment, and all of that, but it didn't make me schizophrenic, and it didn't mean that I had schizoid personality disorder or paranoid personality disorder or any of those things. It meant that in that moment my personality had shifted because it was covered in illness, it didn't necessarily mean that I was an Access 2 diagnosis. Now, schizophrenia is listed as an Access 1 diagnosis along with depression, anxiety, bipolar, ADHD and all that type of thing. So it is something that can run alongside with an eating disorder. So a person may be diagnosed with an eating disorder and then something like bipolar, ADHD or even schizophrenia. My feel on all of this, and this is to be with an eating disorders, and maybe it's a bit idealistic of me, is that you need, if you're watching this, okay, and you're dealing with trauma and you're dealing with issues to do with post-traumatic stress disorder, and you're having hallucinations or you're hearing voices or you are seeing things, hearing things, detaching from reality, that doesn't mean you're completely crazy, okay? And it doesn't mean that somebody's literally going to find out what is going on for you and section you and throw you into hospital. These are fears, genuine fears that people have when it comes to illnesses like schizophrenia, because they believe that people are just going to think they're completely crazy. And it doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean you have schizophrenia because you're dealing with periods of psychosis. I dealt with periods of psychosis, and in my recovery from my eating disorder, it was as I recovered from issues to do with my eating disorder that those periods reduced, that I no longer hallucinate, I no longer have periods of psychosis. I have had moments that people may class as a psychotic episode, but I think that that's quite a loaded phrase, psychotic episode. It can mean more than maybe it needs to mean. So what I would say to you is that if you have been diagnosed with schizophrenia, that it doesn't mean you're not going to be able to live your life. It doesn't mean that medication can't work. It means that you need to recover in the same way you're recovering from your eating disorder. And that type of stuff is learning self-care, like we talked about last week with depression. It's learning how to manage your illness. It's learning how to access support when you need to. It's about learning trigger signs, warning signs. If you are currently still struggling with your eating disorder and you are dealing with issues concerning psychosis, you may have unresolved trauma, you may need to be treated for a type of post-traumatic stress disorder. But I think diagnoses themselves carry too much sometimes for a person, and as much as I believe that being diagnosed with something can help educate you going on for you, I think you have to be very careful that a person isn't boxed in a certain way, and just because things feel disorganized in your life or are being expressed through symptoms such as hallucinations, it doesn't mean that you can't move past that. And so it involves treatment in a very similar way. It involves psychotherapy to deal with trauma or whatever other issues are there. It means maybe probably taking medication to help manage some of those issues. But also schizophrenia can exist, co-morbidity with anxiety disorders and such as well. So that's my kind of feel on symptoms that can be similar to schizophrenia. I'm certainly not an expert when it comes to diagnosing something like schizophrenia, which is why I've not talked so much about the illness itself. I've tried to just discuss some of the symptoms that occur, but it does not necessarily mean that that is what you have. It means that perhaps you're just dealing with symptoms of that will be perhaps expressed in that way. And quite often what can be diagnosed again is schizoid personality disorder, and it's kind of a dumbed down version of schizophrenia, but I very much feel that a person can be in the middle of the eating disorder and be that way as well. So it's all about understanding where you're at really, and accepting that we're all individuals. I hope that's been of some help, and I'm going to go now, and I will see you next week. Okay guys.